Last week, I learned a word that was new to me, intercalation. It's a term that refers to the insertion of one thing into another. Though this word is most often used in science, it is also used in biblical scholarship, and today's reading from the Gospel of Mark is a prime example of that use. For in this passage, Mark has inserted or intercalated one story, one healing story within another. Together, the two stories have much to tell us about the nature of God's love in Jesus Christ. Our passage begins with Jesus and his disciples returning from an excursion across the Sea of Galilee into Gentile territory, where he healed a man tormented by demons. Now, back in Galilee, Jesus finds himself surrounded by a crowd almost as soon as he steps out of the boat, and it isn't long before someone comes to ask him for help. This time, it is the leader of the local synagogue, a man named Jairus, who approaches Jesus. To the surprise of everyone watching, Jairus falls at Jesus' feet and asks him to help his daughter, who is near death. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live," he begs Jesus. In a time when sons were considered more valuable, that this man cared enough for his daughter to seek out and humble himself before an itinerant healer is remarkable, a demonstration of both his love and his desperation. And clearly, Jesus agrees that his plea is worthy, for he immediately goes with the man, the crowd pressing in on him as they walk. But Jairus is not the only one who needs Jesus' help. Among the crowd is a woman who needs healing herself. For 12 long years, she has suffered from hemorrhages, a bloody discharge that will not stop and for which she can find no help, a condition particularly heartbreaking in a patriarchal society where a woman's value was bound up with her ability to bear children, something that was likely impossible for this particular woman. Mark's gospel lays out her situation in a long sentence full of participles. Having suffered, having endured much, having spent all she had, having grown worse, having heard about Jesus, and having come up behind him, she reaches out and touches Jesus' cloak. Imagine her crouching low to the ground, trying not to get stepped on as she peers through all of the cloaks around her to find the one that she seeks. Talk about chutzpah. If I but touch his clothes, she thinks, then I will be made well. Bruce Epperly imagines her saying that over and over and over to herself as she works her way to Jesus. Her act is not only audacious, desperate, but also audacious. For unlike Jairus, she does not ask Jesus for help, but takes it for herself. To make matters worse, because of her chronic condition, she has been ritually unclean for all these years, barred from participation in worship and separated from her family and community. And she comes to Jesus knowing that her touch will render him ritually unclean as well. And yet she comes. And as soon as she touches his cloak, the woman understands that she has been cured, that the flow of power from Jesus has stopped the flow of blood from her body. Jesus is also aware that something has happened. To the bafflement of his disciples and the dismay of Jairus, he stops dead in his tracks, looks intently at the crowd, and asks, "Who touched my clothes?" He knows that the touch that he felt was intentional, and he is not willing to let it go by. Ashamed and fearful, the woman comes and kneels before him, tearfully telling Jesus the whole truth. To her surprise and the astonishment of the crowd, Jesus does not condemn her. He sees the weariness and the heartache of her long suffering, and ever so gently he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Daughter. With that one word, Jesus names this unnamed woman as God's beloved child and blesses her. Daughter, your faith, your willingness to trust, your courage has done this. Live well, live in peace, and confirms for all to hear that she is healed. Her courage and faith have opened the door to Jesus' healing power, and now she will live into a new truth. As one daughter is claimed, however, another is lost. For as Jesus speaks to the woman, people come from Jairus' home to tell him that his daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? Imagine the feelings that surged through Jairus at that moment. Grief, despair, anger at the delay that appears to have cost his daughter her life. Knowing this, Jesus is quick to reassure him. Do not fear, only believe, only trust. James Boyce suggests that this should read something like, stop being afraid, go on living by faith. When they arrive at the house, mourning is already in progress, and when Jesus asserts that the child is not dead but sleeping, he is greeted with derisive laughter. Quickly, he clears the pace and then creates a circle of healing with the child's parents and 3 of his most trusted disciples. And as before, the courage and faith of those around this beloved child opens the door to Jesus' healing power. Gently, he takes the girl's limp hand in his and says to her, Talitha cum, little girl, get up. And she does. She rises from the dead. After ordering her overjoyed parents to say nothing, Jesus indicates his further concern for the girl's welfare and demonstrates for Mark's readers that she is truly alive by instructing her parents to give her food. I love these stories of miraculous healings. At the same time, I am all too aware that many who seek healing from God do not experience it, at least not in the way that they hope. In a commentary on this passage, Catherine Schiffeldecker notes that while Jesus healed many, he did not eliminate all disease, nor did he banish death when he raised Jairus' daughter. Suffering is part of human life. A dramatic physical healing is rare, and the last thing that I want to imply is that the reason that some are not healed is because they lack faith. Instead, I would suggest that healing takes many forms, not all of them physical. The experience of God's ongoing presence, the restoration of loving relationships, the blessing of acceptance and peace even in the face of death. All these forms of healing demonstrate the power of God to bring wholeness and new life. These stories also remind me that ministry often takes place in the interruptions of life. Sometimes those interruptions can be darn annoying. A phone call at an inopportune time, someone demanding attention at the office or on our doorstep, a family member who constantly calls about her problems. Jesus deems the needs of the sick woman and the dying girl, both without power or hope, both at the bottom of the social ladder, as worthy of his attention. And his example encourages us to examine our own priorities and to think about how we decide who or what is worthy of our attention and care. Ultimately, of course, these stories are not about us, but about God. Strangely enough, we find this truth in the curious note that Mark makes about the child's age. He is careful to tell his readers that she is 12 years old. This means that she was born in the year that the woman began to experience hemorrhages. And somehow I doubt that this was a coincidence. In Jewish tradition, numbers have significance, and according to Rabbi Jeffrey Dennis, the number 12 symbolizes totality, wholeness, and completion of God's purpose, or as Reverend Janet Hunt puts it, the fullness of God. Surely these two healings represent that fullness, the total grace and goodness of God. The contrast between Jairus, a wealthy man who is a prominent citizen and a respected leader, and these two unnamed vulnerable daughters is immense. Yet Jesus brings all of them into the circle of God's love, crossing boundaries to respond to their need and to bring new life. These intercalating stories challenge me to imagine just how far that divine circle of love might extend. Does it encompass, for example, all those who took part in Pride celebrations that happened this past month? Does it embrace those who seek safety and asylum in our nation? Is it extended to those girls and boys whose lives are jeoparded by poverty, abuse, or neglect? And what about those in prison or living on the streets? Does the circle of God's love encompass those who have experienced the stigma of having been infected with COVID-19, or more likely these days, the stigma of not being vaccinated? Does it include people who don't look, speak, or worship like me? For that matter, does it include me? Just how wide is the circle of God's love? And how wide is ours? As I ponder these stories, I find myself asking, what happened next? What became of the child who was raised from the dead? Did she become fearful and self-centered? Or perhaps did she grow up to offer compassion and care to others who were dying? And what did the woman do after she was healed? Did she return to her home and spend her days bitterly reflecting on all those lost years? Or perhaps did she find new purpose in ministering to others in her community who were social outcasts, offering a courageous example for them to follow? I like to think that God's love enabled both of these women to live fulfilling, rich lives. And what about this community of faith? Now that things have eased enough for you to gather again, now that a new pastor is joining you, what will happen next? Will you focus solely on the past and what has been lost, or will you look to the future and ponder what you have gained? Will you choose to live out of an attitude of scarcity, carefully conserving your resources, or will you choose to trust in God and live out the abundance of God's grace? Will you concentrate your energies and attention on the people who are here, or reach out to others, even those who are different from you? I would like to imagine what would happen if this church decided to open the circle of love to a rainbow of people, young and old, men and women, able-bodied and differently abled, wealthy and impoverished, light and dark-skinned, gay and straight, leaders of society and those on the margins. What if you opened your arms and encouraged and supported them on their faith journey and allowed them to do the same for you? What if you worked side by side to serve the needs of this community and the world? Imagine. My beloved congregation, my dear friends, I pray that God will guide you as you live into the new chapter of this church's life. May the love of God that encircles all of us inspire you in turn to draw wide the circle of your love, so that all will know the joy of the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And above all, may the glory be to God. Amen and amen.